What's up? How you doing? I am David Long. You know what it is. Recently, on the Integral Stage, I had a talk come out with Layman Pascal, and Bruce Alderman was hanging out, and we were talking about the pre-trans fallacy. You should definitely go over there and check out the full-length video, but just to kind of entice you, here's a couple clips from the video.
The reason I even came to the integral community and saw it as an exciting thing in the first place, or maybe one of the original reasons that I resonated with Ken Wilber, was because my first or maybe most impactful major teacher in my life besides Ken Wilber is Joseph Campbell. And as a person who was raised in a really religious home, and I spent a lot of time studying those symbols, and then having lost that and deconstructed it and being interested in other symbol sets like Buddhism and really feeling the importance of religion and spirituality, finding Joseph Campbell was really helpful and important to me because he really helped me. He was, I would say, the first implicitly integral teacher that I ever had. Like, if you understand Joseph Campbell's projects, his methodology and what he's doing a meta-analysis and understanding like the universal cultural and personal themes, and sort of like taking this very integral perspective on religion. And when I came across Wilber, he seemed to be doing this too. In fact, like one of the early intro materials that I started watching was his Cosmic Consciousness interview series. And in that, he explicitly says that he gets this idea of the pre-trans distinction, pre-trans-rational, from Joseph Campbell, and that he was a big fan of Joseph Campbell.
Joseph Campbell, probably the recent era's greatest mythology or interpretive mythology, and somebody I certainly cut my teeth on. I was a great admirer of his and a really extraordinary work that he did. He used to very, very vehemently, actually, say that there's really sort of two types of mythology, or mythology forms two different functions. He wouldn't use the terms pre-rational and trans-rational, but the way we're talking about them is the way he would talk about these two functions of mythology. And the first function is when mythology is taken to be concretely real. But what some people do, particularly educated, intelligent people like us that are trying to get some meaning in our lives, we can tend to take myths as deeply symbolic of something else. Campbell knew this, as if the capacity to form a cognition that says it's as if this is the case, or would be, it's transrational. It can represent a deeper self, a higher self. It can represent oneness with all of reality. The Christ mythos itself is made to order for all sorts of interpretations. So that's a very, very distinguishing way to tell the difference between pre-rational myths that are taken to be concretely, literally true, and trans-rational myths that may represent some very high transpersonal dimensions. So as long as we take both of those into account, then we have this sort of more integral overview. And the problem, again, with the pre-trans fallacy is that people like Freud take every trans-rational as if higher mythology and reduce it to two-year-old infantile nonsense. And on the other hand, way too many people take a lot of the pre-rational stuff and elevate it to trans-rational glory it just doesn't have.
From the outside, how do you know if this person's operating at a pre-rational or trans-rational level? Would it be if they were able to say, I'm going to act as if?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you ask them exactly what is it that you're doing. If they're making an empirical claim, check it empirically. On the other hand, it can be very high kind of metaphoric, an as-if interpretive tool or Rorschach block.
He says that Campbell talks about it the same way that he would talk about it, except for in integral, we speak about it in developmental terms. So that's the difference. That's the difference between the integral pre-trans-rational versus what Joseph Campbell was doing. Basically, Joseph Campbell says that traditional people take their symbols literally, and rational people also take the symbols literally. So they're like, no, that's wrong. That's false. That's not true. It doesn't hold up. It doesn't work. And then some people are able to read the symbols poetically, psychologically, as archetypes of humanity, grasping to try to understand what's going on in reality, and that there are deeper truths to be found in these things.
So there's a area right there that maybe you're at the intersection of, which is a couple of different factions within the integral community would hold the ontological status of the poetic differently than others, right? When you say psychological, some people will have a certain association with that, where they're basically inhabiting a rational material universe and they're investigating an abstract subjective element. And some other people would think, based on their experiences and or fantasies, that they're describing a kind of additional reality of some sort, whether it's explored or thought well through or not. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a problem, and it all comes back to epistemology and methodology. Like, do we have that? I mean, this is why understanding the tools and the philosophy is so important, because what a lot of people are doing are they're working backwards from some kind of a religious idea, which would be a pre-trans fallacy, and then they're building all this other stuff on top of it. So if you don't have a rational worldview that is founded from the ground up and makes sense and is solid, and if you don't, it's like, if you don't have a good foundation, everything you build on it is questionable and is going to be potentially problematic. So this is something that we need to think about a lot, because we're going to need to upgrade the integral map. We need to upgrade integral distinctions. Wilbur is really the first word on this kind of stuff. So it's up to us to be able to take this work further. And part of that means we need to do the work to follow these ideas back to their roots. You know, like we've done here, we've seen that Wilbur's talking about Campbell's work, and through understanding both of those things and through understanding development and vision logic in general, from this integral perspective, from a trans-rational perspective, from the perspective of vision logic, we can see what these things really mean. And it's not just about metaphor, because there are Christians, of course, or traditional people who, of course, would be like, yeah, the Bible has metaphors in it. But that doesn't mean that they take the story of Jesus metaphorically. They're like, yeah, there's parables and stories and metaphors in the Bible, sure. But it doesn't mean that they understand that even God, even the concept of God, is a metaphor. So really, once you go down this rabbit hole, a better definition is actually something like understanding the relative nature of language or symbolism. So this is what Joseph Campbell is talking about, and this is what Ken Wilber is talking about, and this is what vision logic is about understanding the relative nature of language, the relative nature of symbolism, the relative nature of stories, and of course that includes the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves and our kind of personal mythologies. So that's what ego construct awareness is about. So as we've talked about already, these different stages of vision logic, at early stages of vision logic, at green, there's the initial deconstruction, realizing the relative nature of all language, but kind of creating a flatland, right? And then at early integral stages, starting to integrate diversity with discernment, but more for me, at a personal level, like how can I figure out how to put this stuff together or understand all of this stuff that's going on in context. And then at an integrally informed stage, having the maps, having the tools, having the distinctions, and being able to live that stuff out in the world. I've heard some people suggest that instead of calling it trans-rational, that we call it post-formal. And I think this is a good way of talking about it too, because the rational stage is one way of talking about it. The formal operational stage is another way of talking about it, about that particular stage of development. And to think about it as like being post-formal, you can kind of see into those words what it means. It's like if we have our formal way of talking about things, then being post-formal is like seeing through our regular way of talking about things. I think a great example that I like to point to that really I think is a great expression of a trans-rational or post-formal view is this quote by Nietzsche. He says, "What then is truth? A vast mobile army of metaphors, metonyms, and anthropomorphisms, a sum of human relations which have been enhanced, transposed, and embellished poetically and rhetorically, and which after long use seem firm, canonical, and obligatory to a people. Truths are illusions about which one has forgotten that is what they are. Metaphors which are worn out and without sensuous power, coins which have lost their picture, and now matter only as metal, no longer as coins. We still do not know where the urge for truth comes from, for as of yet we have heard only of the obligation imposed by society that it should exist. To be truthful means using the customary metaphors in moral terms, the obligation to lie according to fixed convention, or to lie herd-like in a style obligatory for all. He's making a claim about truth claims here. He's not saying that there's no truth. He's saying that the way that we talk about truth is wrapped in language, is wrapped in metaphor, is wrapped in poetry. So I think that we can talk about this stuff in the language of Buddhism, and that can be a good way of talking about it, but maybe a better way is to talk about it in the language of philosophy and existentialism. The second thing is that we know Wilber commits pre-trans fallacy number 2. He takes his traditional symbols literally. He thinks that's the one true way of thinking about things, and he messes up the stages in light of his biases, not based on the actual evidence from developmental psychology. So that's a major problem. But another major problem, I think, is that Integral to some extent has become a bit of a category game. You know, like, well, that's science, that's the upper right quadrant, like the things like that. And then, okay, well, science is in the upper right quadrant, but if we're including science, shouldn't we also be including the best versions of science and the best versions of the conclusions that they come up with? There's a whole bunch of controversy within the topic of science. So how do we know what to go with? A lot of people are including a lot of things at Integral, but just because we're including all these factors doesn't mean we're getting all the factors right. This is why we really have to continue to debate and see how we can upgrade our stuff. Is the integration really good and true? And so when it comes to claims about cosmology, we have to be using the right methodology. And when we're making claims about cosmology, that's not a trans-rational claim. That's a rational claim. And as Wilber says, we need to test those claims empirically.
So I have a few videos now on the integral stage, one on sacred naturalism, one on states from an emergentist perspective, and now this one about the pre-trans fallacy. I hope you'll go check it out. Also, make sure you subscribe to the Integral Stage, like and subscribe to my channel. Make sure you like if you like, ring the bell if you haven't. Thanks so much for hanging out. Thanks for your time. Hope you have a great one. Peace.